Bristol is a town situated in the county of the same name in the state of Rhode Island. It was founded as part of the Plymouth colony in the year 1680 on land that had been taken from the local native people following King Philip's War. 67 years later, Bristol was among a few former Massachusetts towns that were incorporated into the eastern part of the colony of Rhode Island and Providence plantations. Through this act, Bristol was absorbed into a colony that went on to play a significant role in early resistance to the British government. The most locally famous of these acts of resistance, and perhaps the most violent, was the burning of the revenue schooner HMS Gaspee in June of 1772. Following the Boston Tea Party in 1773, regular reporting on the growing unrest due to the British occupation of that city was published in Rhode Island newspapers, such as the Newport Mercury. Before open warfare broke out in 1775, several new militia units were raised in Rhode Island. 6 men were ordered to keep watch in each coastal town, and respected members of society were sent to other colonies to discuss measures of common defense. Rhode Island played a large part in the eventual war in New England, and Bristol itself was burned by British forces in 1778. Aside from such large events of great local importance, Bristol also contributed many of its men to the war effort and active resistance to the British. This service took many forms, serving in the government, the local militia, the Continental Army, and so on. These people also had many different reasons for serving. In 1774, the entire population of the town of Bristol stood at 1,209, including 197 heads of families. By 1776, the total number had dropped to 1,067. By the end of the Revolutionary War in 1783, at least 170 of Bristol's citizens had served the cause of the new nation in some capacity. The largest number of Bristolians who served during the Revolutionary War did so in the local militia. They served in a company made up entirely of their neighbors, and likely friends. A good example is William Throop. Throop was born on the 13th day of June, 1739. In August of 1776, he was listed as a lieutenant in Stephen Smith's company of the Bristol County Militia Regiment commanded by Nathaniel Martin. The next year, just before he turned 38, Throop was a captain, serving in the Newport and Bristol County Militia Regiment commanded by Nathan Miller. Serving under Throop were Lieutenant Joseph Reynolds, Jr., Ensign Jonathan Diamond, and a few dozen other fellow Bristolians. These local companies usually only operated within the colony or state in which they were raised. When war broke out in the spring of 1775, Rhode Island sent its Army of Observation, commanded by Brigadier General Nathaniel Greene, to join the Massachusetts militia besieging the British Army in Boston. The regiment, which comprised the troops from Newport and Bristol counties, was commanded by Bristolian Thomas Church. Bristolians served in the Continental Army through the length of the war. Nelson Miller, who had been a drummer in Scion Martindale's company during the siege of Boston, also served in the Battle of White Plains in 1776, in the company commanded by Loring Peck, also of Bristol. He enlisted multiple times, concluding his final term of service in 1781. Prince Ingraham was also still serving in 1781, with the Corps of Sappers and Miners during the siege of Yorktown. The Rhode Island militia were heavily involved in the war locally. In 1777, they made up a large portion of Major General Joseph Spencer's army during his failed attempt to retake Aquidneck Island from British forces. The next year, they, along with Continental troops, followed Major General John Sullivan on a similar expedition with a similar result. Participation in the Revolution was not limited to one class or group of people in Bristol. William Bradford, a descendant of the prominent Mayflower passenger of the same name, served on Rhode Island's Committee of Safety, as well as being deputy governor of Rhode Island during the war. Simeon Potter, a wealthy slave trader and sea captain, served as Major General of the Rhode Island militia shortly before the start of the war. Potter's nephews, the DeWolf brothers, who later went on to be Bristol's wealthiest inhabitants due to the slave trade, served on privateer ships owned by their aforementioned uncle during the war. On the other side of things, there were the enslaved people, several of whom are known to have served. One of these was Prince Ingraham, who was enslaved to militia captain Jeremiah Ingraham. Not long after it was formed, Prince enlisted in the 1st Rhode Island Regiment. The 1st Rhode Island Regiment was a Continental Army unit raised in 1778, which permitted enslaved men to enlist in exchange for their freedom. These men were needed to fill the ranks of Rhode Island's Continental regiments, because, to quote the Act of the General Assembly, "This state is obliged to raise a very considerable number of troops for its own immediate defense." Most of Bristol's veterans fall into that very considerable number who served to protect their town and the surrounding area from the threat of British attack, while occasionally launching attacks on the British garrison in Newport. Each state was also required to contribute a set number of troops to the Continental Army. Rhode Island simply did not have enough able-bodied white men who wanted to or were able to enlist in the National Army to fight and perhaps die far from their homes, and also fill the ranks of the militia tasked with defending those homes. The enslaved people who were now permitted to enlist had the incentive of freedom, assuming they survived their term of service. They were also offered all the bounties, wages, and encouragements that were given to all other soldiers, though as Joseph Plum Martin, a Continental soldier from Connecticut, records in his memoir, Continental troops in general were rarely ever paid, clothed, or fed during the war. Bristol, at this time, was a seafaring town, and many of its citizens made their contribution to the war effort, and often to their own personal fortunes, on the high seas. There were the aforementioned DeWolf brothers, serving on their uncle's privateer ships, while the militia served to protect their immediate surroundings, and many enslaved people enlisted to gain their freedom. Privateers did what they did to make money. With permission from the government, they attacked and captured British ships, then sold their cargoes. People have always lived different and unique lives. What all of these people shared is the fact that they lived in the same place at the same time. There were many of them. They served in different ways and capacities. They had different reasons and motivations for serving. They are all connected to each other because they each had some involvement in the conflict that separated the United States from the United Kingdom. The stories recounted here are an interesting example of these different people and their different experiences. The truth about history is that there is always more research to be done. There are many of Bristol's Revolutionary veterans with very little, if anything at all, known about them and their experiences, but each of them lived their own interesting and eventful lives over 200 years ago. The research recounted here is just a tiny speck of the information that exists about this collection of people at this time. There is always more to be learned.